So welcome, everybody. Let's see, it's January 19th, 2025. Soto Zen. And it's your great misfortune to be giving the Dharma talk today. I'm just clowning around. Okay, today I thought I'd talk about authenticity and about feeling vulnerable. And I mean, I was scheduled to speak today, and I'm not resistant to speaking, but it just felt like inauthentic because I haven't been feeling like spiritually fit, lately. I mean, you hear that phrase in AA sometimes. I mean, if you define spiritual fitness as being like very hopeful or positive or trying to looking good, I haven't been. I mean, like most everybody, I mostly want to look good on the outside and then, not get into deeply to things that aren't going so well for me or sound like I'm complaining. But then it occurred to me that maybe that feeling was actually something worth talking about because it feels like, suffering and vulnerability are central to like Buddhist teachings. And I guess honesty about suffering was one of the teachings that actually drew me to the practice of Zazen. I mean, it was actually something that I could relate to. It was a big relief to me when I heard that the Buddhist teaching was about, there's suffering in your life and it's not just you and you don't have to feel alone and it's part of your life and you belong in the world. And like yesterday, Cynthia and I were laughing. I should probably not say this, but about all the Buddhists we know that have been, had mental health struggles or a history of addiction or just have a hard time getting along in the world. But what was funny was that we fit right in. We called them our people. I mean, we were clowning around, but there was actually a lot of love in it. But just knowing that imperfect people were drawn to the practice and doing it imperfectly, that's actually a very big relief to me. So, like the Buddhist teaching on suffering, that was an opening for me. And then I also heard that there was something that you could do about suffering. Like, I don't mean that to say that, I feel like practice is going to always be pleasant or it's going to level off into this kind of like perfect place, but mostly that I could feel differently about my own suffering, like not have to hide it or not judge myself harshly for it, and that I could approach that like in a different way with some heart and with some wisdom and some sympathy for myself. I mean, the teaching on suffering, it really validated my experience of the world. And that was an experience that everybody in my original family was trying so desperately to deny. I mean, in the first part of my life, I really felt like everybody got the guidebook on how to live a life and that somehow I was left out of that. And if you'd grown up in my family, you probably would have felt that too. I mean, all the rules of the alcoholic family were firmly in place in my family. Don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. Don't talk about anything painful. And my family really took refuge in distractions to suffering, like money, desire, getting what they thought they wanted, power, control. I mean, most of my family are like third chakra power trippers, motivated by desire for control. And growing up in my family was like living in a boarding house with people that you knew, and they're there, but they never really show themselves very often. And even though, they were addicted to drama and there was lots of people around, it was fundamentally a cold place. I mean, nobody ever really took a chance on intimacy in my family. I mean, and the unspoken rule in my family was, don't bring me any pain, just bring me your happiness. Like, do your work, don't talk, don't trust, don't feel. And those are the rules of the alcoholic family. My mother was an alcoholic. I mean, she did get into recovery in her mid-50s. And, she was also like totally charming and charismatic and intelligent. Like, I mean, so many people I've met in 12-step programs. But, when I was growing up, she was an addict. I mean, and she did die clean and sober with like 30 years under her belt. But growing up with her at that time, the very definition of conditional love. And then my father, I would call him toxically positive. I mean, he was so evidently suffering in the worst possible ways. And he did, take his own life in the end. I mean, and he was old by then anyway, but he drove his car into a tree going about 120 miles an hour. And he was trying to make it look like an accident, but nobody really believed that. But that he died is not such a big tragedy. But the real tragedy of his life to me is that he couldn't talk about it, like how he was doing. He couldn't ask for help. So, that was my family. I mean, and it was one of the biggest mysteries to me in my family was that we never talked to each other about anything that was the most obvious situations. Like the fact that everybody in my family's lonely together, or everybody's terrified of having feelings, or that nobody says anything authentic to each other. So you weren't allowed to suffer in my family, even though everybody was suffering tremendously. So being loyal to my family system meant, taking drugs and alcohol. But at the same time, it was don't abandon, but don't confront. I mean, if you voiced a concern in my family, that was a betrayal. And I say those things, and I also have to say I loved my parents, but nobody had the language to explain themselves to themselves. I mean, it didn't exist at the time. So, it was challenging, and my whole family was lost, and nobody's able to talk about it. And then I got clean and sober. I started sitting, but I have to say, I couldn't share in Alcoholics Anonymous for about the first 10 years I was sober. I just sat in the back, mostly because I didn't know how to share my own feelings, my own experience of suffering. I'd heard other people talk about their lives in meetings, and I thought, how they do that? It felt impossible for me. But so just in terms of Buddhism and AA, I mean, the miracle for me was that the Buddha had named it, and that I found that to be so liberating. I mean, what I'm really talking about is being honest. Like, the most frightening thing to admit is that you're, afraid or inept or clumsy, or you feel stupid. But also, what a relief. I mean, perfectionism is just such a disease in itself. So I really like it that we can do those things together. One of the things I like best about 12-step recovery is that the starting point is just admitting that you're an utter failure, and how freeing that is. I mean, admitting that your life is just totally fucked up. It's a great starting point because it's so humble and it's so honest, but there's a truth that's quivering right there underneath the surface. Really starting with the fact that everything's always changing. Even things that are good in life, there'll be suffering. Even loving people. And I've loved some people very deeply in my life, but the price tag for love is grief, because in time you will be separated. I mean, the end of meeting is parting. So that's a reality. That's not something you can just resolve by wishing it away. But it's also said that the Buddha discovered the nature of reality, that he understood it, and that it's possible that you and I could too. I mean, understanding the nature of reality could find freedom from suffering, just like 12-step programs. Like, waking up to your own suffering is actually part of the path. And inside that, we find each other in this kind of vulnerability, instead of feeling so cut off and so apart from each other. So to be available to suffering, I mean, first you have to acknowledge your own. So, I'm here today to say, I've been suffering. So let's see, I had a bad fall, and I tore my ACL in October of I guess it was 2022. Then it took me 6 months to get a knee replacement. And now I got a knee replacement that's failed and like spectacularly. I mean, and now I have to get all that equipment removed and replaced with even more complicated equipment. But I went to see the orthopedic revisionist, and he referred to the procedure as technically demanding with a high risk of complications. I mean, not exactly reassuring words from a surgeon. So, I mean, and that's just one more insult and a long list of like terrible illnesses that I've accumulated in my life. You know, when I was a young person, I had Guillain-Barré syndrome, and I was paralyzed, and I was on a ventilator, and I was blind. I was in the hospital for a year. I mean, and you know, it's the accumulated suffering of a lifetime of physical troubles. So, you know, I sometimes I'm just feeling so discouraged and so disappointed, like one more debilitating event. But then I started thinking about that and thinking, like, maybe if I just say how shitty I feel, that could actually be an opening for me, which then got me thinking about just vulnerability in general, like meaning emotional exposure, like that kind of very unstable feeling you get when you do something that forces you to lose control. Like, you know, well, like for me, like physical illness really brings up this like feelings of like helplessness, like loss of control, and all my unresolved childhood wounds really come to the surface. I mean, I've been sober for 38 years. I'm still working on reparenting myself. I mean, and then like just in terms of Buddhism, I think understanding suffering is really like the whole of our spiritual path. I mean, this basic idea, like from a relative point of view, that the things you want things to be other than the way they are, and then that causes you suffering. Like you want good things to be permanent, you want bad things to go away faster, you want to get what you want, and you want to be permanently satisfied with that. But that's really contrary to reality. I mean, we all get sick, we all die, we all have conflicts. The whole economy of the world operates around getting what you want, getting away from things you don't want, or just tuning out from the world. I mean, otherwise known as greed, hate, and delusion. And it's really hard to be satisfied with things just the way they are. I mean, that's the realm of ordinary suffering. I mean, the standard list includes, let's say, sickness, old age, death, lament, pain, grief, and despair. I mean, classically defined as wanting something and not getting it, getting something and not being satisfied with it, separated from things you love, or put in proximity to situations and people that you dislike. So that's the realm of ordinary suffering. But also, according to Buddhist teachings, and more to the truth of suffering, which is this habit of mind, like to assume that there's some separate, unchanging entity that's known as I or you. I mean, even though this seemingly sort of permanent thing that's known as I has to keep changing its definitions constantly to keep up that illusion in a world that's impermanent. And Buddhism and Zazen in particular make you aware of a mind that's always trying to prop up the illusion of separateness. I mean, it's like you have like a succession of selves in different times in your life, and then the sheer futility of blaming yourself for decisions that you made earlier in your life, when at that time you were just working with the best information that was available to you. So it's true that we, you know, everybody has responsibility for managing their lives and making decisions, I mean, inside the boundaries of your own body. But according to Buddhist teaching, it's also true that your mind is contorting itself to sort of meet the demands of propping up the illusion of permanence or solidity. It's kind of like a chronic background suffering, like nausea. So when you sit Zazen, it's really a chance to investigate all the sensations that make up your moment-to-moment reality, which is to see something really extraordinary about the unsatisfactoriness of experience. I mean, if you look closely, you could see that even pleasant sensations have a tinge of unsatisfactoriness to them. And that's really valuable information. I mean, and the unsatisfactoriness is born from impermanence. You can really identify moment to moment phenomena of suffering by looking at sensations that arise, express themselves, and then vanish. I mean, nothing lasts. And you can really see that in Zazen. There's no thought, there's no mind state, there's no object, there's no possession in your life which will permanently satisfy you. And that's not to say that the conventional sort of day-to-day wisdom of just taking care of yourself and other people around you isn't important. I mean, you have to do what it takes to live in the material world, but where everybody's a lot more interesting than that. Everything you think of as solid is just arising and passing in a moment. I've been having a lot of physical pain, lots of anxiety, and then I've been trying to use that as an object of meditation. Like, I'm prone to anxiety. You probably know that about me. But I was with David for a few days and I just couldn't, I mean, it's right on the edge of feeling overwhelmed. But that feeling of shakiness, like that sort of remorse and the despair and the kind of shame, and trying to stay with that, like to sit with a broken heart, that's actually a path right there. Like sticking with that uncertainty, like trying to relax into it when in the midst of like chaos is actually a spiritual practice. I mean, and to calm yourself, like that's at the heart of the practice. So in adult children of alcoholics, which I'm very involved in, that's known as arousing your own loving parent, which is actually a skill set. So I'm a loving parent in training, but generally speaking, you know, I regard discomfort as bad news. But because we're Zen Buddhists, you know, we have a certain hunger to know what's true about the world. So feelings like disappointment or embarrassment or resentment or anger or jealousy or fear, you know, instead of being bad news, it's actually kind of a clear moment that teaches me where I'm holding back. Like, I like to see, like, what model in my mind is being challenged at the moment? Like, do I think that the world should be like solid and stable and always dependable? Or do I think that suffering's basically unfair? Once I heard Ram Dass say that suffering is sandpaper for the soul, like suggesting that, you know, suffering, like it has this ability to transform things, like maybe the abrasiveness of sandpaper strips away like what's superficial in the world. So Cynthia and Sherry and Brian and I sat with Peter yesterday, and I was so acutely aware of noticing like the qualities of Peter's heart. Sorry. There's just a lot of tenderness there. I mean, if you guys don't know Peter, he was recently diagnosed with cancer, but I saw this kind of like vulnerability in him. And, you know, like some kind of openness that I hadn't seen before. And so, you know, sometimes getting a diagnosis, like it lets people open to sort of giving and receiving love in a way they maybe hadn't been able to. You know, I was a hospice nurse in the AIDS epidemic. And like what I saw was that even though like the fire of suffering was often so intense with AIDS, but also it created all these opportunities for kindness, for love, for solidarity, really drew people together. Like gay culture before the AIDS epidemic was so shallow and so drug-fueled and so shame-driven. So, you know, getting a diagnosis really drives home the Buddhist teachings on impermanence and this illusion that you'll always be healthy and make clear-headed decisions. And, you know, it's a false narrative. I mean, it's the nature of things to disintegrate. And so when I get upset about that, then I try to take a second look. I mean, these are feelings are like messengers. They really show you with a lot of clarity where you're stuck. Like we chant, you know, this moment is the perfect teacher. And this moment lucky for us, it's wherever we are. I mean, we don't sit zazen to become perfect meditators, even though you could see improvement, I think. But when you sit in zazen so that you'll be more awake in your day-to-day life, and there's something about quieting down like that, that the part of your heart that yearns for healing really naturally presents itself when you sit zazen. So I'm not trying to live up to some kind of, bodhisattva ideal where I levitate and I get clairvoyant, or just trying to like be with my experience, like whatever it is, like as shabby and sort of disheartening as that as my experience can be, and then just identifying my feelings and trying to name them and watch them leave. So, if I have to remind myself that if I'm on a spiritual journey with the hope of like getting security, then I'm really kind of missing the point. I mean, one of the things I really do like about Buddhist teaching is seeing everything as the past. It's not just that everything that happens is usable and it's workable, but it's actually the path itself. I mean, I want to use those things as a means for waking up, and that things are fundamentally groundless. And it's really hard to sit still with this fear of losing control. My practice today is just to see if there's a way I can just be with the moment and then sort of honor it. And then, just leaving the house looks like an uncertainty for me at the moment. And last night I was thinking, what about 10 years from now? How am I going to manage? I mean, which is ridiculous. I mean, coming back to the here and now, it's like always this process of reorientation. And that's what we learn in Zazen. So here's what I'm trying to do today. Trying to be grateful. I can walk around the house. I mean, I can get to the bathroom and from the bathroom to the bed. I can work from home. I have some work that's really important for me. I have to have some work. Trying to forgive myself for making big mistakes in my life. I fell, I got a bad surgery, I got hurt because of it, but life's really full of those kind of events. I mean, it's what good to rail out against the world. And just being grateful for my friends. Sorry. Everybody's been so generous, Steve and David and Sitya and Laureen, like really super supportive. It just feels like another sort of difficult chapter in a life that's been blessed by big mistakes and bad judgment and addiction and bad boyfriends, So just trying to meet those things with some kind of gentleness and bring some kind of curiosity to it. So here's my Buddhist message for today. I feel like shit. I'm really scared about what's going to happen next, and that's the truth. And so I thought maybe if I just talked about it, it'll kind of move the energy along. So I really like Suzuki's teaching on one continuous mistake. And I get so much from being connected to everybody. I mean, this Zen Buddhist practice is a real nourishment for me. So thank you all for showing up today. Let's stop there and sit for a little while.